Rachel Bernstein, thank you so much for coming on to Talk Beliefs. This is going to be a very interesting interview because not only are you part of the IndoctriNation podcast, which deals with cults, but you also work with ex-cult members and do interventions. But before we start, can you just tell us a little bit about you, your background, and what led you to where you are now?
Yes, I get asked this question a lot because it's kind of a unique field to go into. And so when I was growing up, a family member got ensnared in Scientology, and that kind of did it for the whole family. We just zeroed in on what this thing could be that could take over somebody's world, take over their mind, take over their sense of self, make them clean out their bank account, after one meeting. What is this thing that can gain this kind of power, and also that can divide someone from their family and divide someone from their self? So when I went off to college, I started noticing there were kind of cults all around me. And I don't mean that in a paranoid way. But, a lot of cults do their recruiting on college campuses, but call themselves something else. So they have these front names, as you know. So I was just seeing, in the student union tables for different groups. And I thought, people don't even quite know. And parents also who are sending their kids to university, that there are people preying on them, at university. So when I was studying education and then going on to get my counseling degree, I thought there has to be a part of either my teaching career or my counseling career where I devote to doing some cult education and prevention, because I saw it as not only an interesting kind of way of researching the mind and what makes us vulnerable, but also I saw it as a human rights issue.
Because you've been a counselor for over 20 years, I think. Is that right?
Yeah. 28, actually, as of this year.
Cool.
And I used to, when I first started, I was working at a general clinic, and then there was an opening at a place called the Cult Clinic in Los Angeles, which is now no longer Scientology, kind of ran it into the ground. Anyway, long story, but that's what they did with a lot of places. And then moved to New York and worked at the Cult Hotline and Clinic, and started running support groups also for families who had loved ones involved in cults and for former cult members. Came back here, no clinics available, no resources for people. So I just said, okay, I'll do this as part of my private practice. It's now about 3/4 of my private practice. And I also run a weekly support group for former cult members, for their families. And also now I've expanded it where I work with people who have been involved with malignant narcissists, because it's almost identical to being in a cult.
It's LA, is that right?
I'm in LA, which is, of course, a hotbed, but it's not the only one. There are many
Scientology is everywhere there, isn't it?
Scientology is everywhere here. It's also everywhere in, Clearwater, Florida is their hub, where they have their naval ships and other places. But here, they have the Celebrity Center and their big, spooky, disturbing museum, the Anti-Psychiatry Museum in Hollywood.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I've heard of that.
Yeah, there's a street here called L. Ron Hubbard Way. Like, crazy. Anyway, it is what it is. But Scientology is big here. I have a lot of Scientology clients or former Scientologists, some who are still in, who don't want people to know they've accessed the dreaded therapist because they're not allowed to go for therapy. I have to make sure to stagger them in my waiting area so they don't run into each other, just in case one is still in and one is going to tell on the other person. And so I have to be careful.
The snitching element. You get a lot of that in cults, don't you?
Yeah, exactly. It's a way to kind of maintain your status within the group or move up in the hierarchy.
And you're on the advisory board of the Open Minds Foundation and have interviewed many experts in the field of cultic studies, including, we just talked about Scientology. You also interviewed a Scientology founder, L. Ron Hubbard's great-grandson, Jamie DeWolf.
Yeah.
So can you talk about the Open Minds Foundation and what its aims are and what exactly you do for the board?
Yeah, so it's a fantastic new organization. And there are people on the board who are from all over the world, which is a wonderful insight about how different countries deal with these issues and what they think of them. I mean, I had gotten my start with the Cult Awareness Network, which then was taken over by Scientology, which is, just so you know, for any of your viewers, if people call something called the Cult Awareness Network, they're now calling Scientology. So before it had been taken over by them, I was involved with them, then something called the American Family Foundation, then in the International Cultic Studies Association, which I'm still involved with and run some of their LA workshops and go to their conferences all over. But then this Open Minds Foundation started with a different kind of philosophy, a different way of looking at this, which is really quite fascinating to me. And I'm on their advisory board. And also, I'm going to be part of a group of therapists, counselors who are going to be offering kind of a program for people to get back on their feet. But the idea of the Open Minds Foundation is to understand what makes us vulnerable and to hope to weave into popular culture, to school systems, the curriculum, etc., ways to engender critical thinking, being able to question how a study is done, the results of the study, to know if you're being really lied to, if you're being coerced, if there's undue influence, how to detect it, how to prevent yourself from getting kind of sucked in. So even though I'll be doing a program to help people that, you know, have gotten involved, which is nice that they're taking care of those people as well, the real bent is to say, how do we shore up people in a better way so that they don't then go out and become the followers of someone who's taking advantage of them? How do we help them become better kind of emotional and spiritual consumers in the world?
Well, Rachel, you work with people who have left cults, as we've said, as well as those who are still in cults. You do what's known as interventions as well. Now, for anybody who doesn't know, what exactly is an intervention and when is an intervention needed?
Those are great questions, and I'm so glad you're asking me, because a lot of people have this sense that an intervention is sort of how it's portrayed in the movies, in this very kind of alarmist way, where you kind of zoom in and you have this windowless van, which my kids call the kidnap van, and you know,
the James Wood films come to mind with split image.
Right, exactly.
That's the wrong way. That's the wrong way to do it.
This is the wrong way. This is something I would never participate in. The only thing that I make sure of really is that a person or a family has to be okay with the person being free to go at any time. Because you don't want to have it be where they're kind of out of the frying pan into the fire, where you're just another person pulling them in a direction against their will and against their knowledge. So it's really a conversation. It's a very respectful kind of dialogue. And even before we get to the intervention piece, I do mostly about 90% of the interventions I call mini interventions, where I find out about the people who that cult member has contact with, if they have contact with them. Of course, it's much harder if there's no contact, but not impossible. And then I say, okay, what has your dialogue been like in the past? Have you fought about this? Have you gotten into a dead end because the person in the cult has been kind of guided to be confrontative or to be defensive or to see you as the enemy? Let's change the conversation and see if there's a way you can draw them out, help them reconnect with you in a safe way. That's a mini intervention. And sometimes those are really wonderful, because then once you have safe dialogue again, the person doing it can infuse future conversations with some cult education without calling it that. And so it's a really nice way, kind of under the radar way of doing an intervention. If none of those things work, and I have a lot of ideas for mini interventions, but if they just haven't worked, could be the timing isn't right, could be the person is so into it because they just got in that they're in this sort of honeymoon phase, and that's like talking someone out of a new relationship they're in. You know,
it's too early for the doubts to have set in.
Exactly. And they haven't seen the things themselves that, would cause them to doubt it. They're not ready. They don't want to see it. So timing plays a big issue of the interventions. But, I've done interventions with people where to this day, I mean, they might know if they see this then, that they don't know there was an intervention that was done. We were just friends of the family. If I went with colleagues to do the intervention, we were people who were invited to just have a conversation. What I think is really very powerful to let people know is that if they plan an intervention that can go on for a few days of just conversations and maybe showing some videos to help them understand the group they're in, because when people are involved in a cult, the members are the ones who know the least about the group, because they're not allowed to access information about it. They're not allowed to go online. They're not allowed to talk to former members and find out where they left and why they left. So we all know much more about a cult than the members do, which is always interesting to remember. But I think once you kind of get involved in an intervention, the families sometimes get quite devastated if after their loved one goes back. But that's not necessarily the end of the story. They might not have been ready to leave, but you spent now a couple of days infusing them with good cult education. So then a lot of times they go back and they start to see what you're talking about. Oh, that's that technique. No wonder it makes me feel so bad. Oh, I see now why I was made to feel that my family was the enemy. I get it. And they had to kind of see it for themselves.
And so is there a difference between that as an intervention, and we hear this word in the past, deprogramming, and now we hear this phrase exit counseling? Would you say these are different animals or not?
The typical kind of scary way of thinking about it was the deprogramming. And those were more forcible. Those were kind of also before my time in this field. And so an exit counseling is basically then, it became sort of the new word for a non-forcible deprogramming. So I know this is confusing. So deprogramming isn't used anymore, even though that is what we're doing. We are deprogramming the person who's been programmed, but they're not called that because it has this negative, forcible kind of connotation. And so now we say intervention or exit counseling. Interestingly, because of these shows that have been on about interventions where people walk into a room and all their family and friends are sitting in a circle with a letter that's been prepared, and that's what people are expecting with an intervention. But I have to let people know what they've seen on the telly is not, how it always is. So I use exit counseling and intervention now interchangeably, and it connotes a non-forcible way of dealing with somebody who's involved in a cult.
The general public are often baffled as to why anybody would let themselves get sucked into a cult, often giving up their homes, family, all their money just to follow a group or a guru. So how are people in cults kept from listening to their own intuitions and from ignoring the red flags that will then keep them locked inside those cults?
Also great questions. So I think a lot about this quote by Dr. Margaret Singer, who had been a professor at the University of California at Berkeley. She had studied a lot about, a lot about mind control and government mind control kind of programs, and how people get kind of how their psyche gets undermined in that way. And she said that when you're involved in a cult or a controlling relationship, you learn to deny the evidence of your senses. So if, for example, you are feeling tired because they haven't let you sleep for days on end, they will want you to keep working 20 hours a day or more, because they have to keep the machine running, and they need for you to be out on the street selling things, or they need for you to be bringing in new members. So they will tell you you're not really tired, that's your defeatist attitude, that's your weakness, that's a kind of spiritual exhaustion, whatever it is, other terms. So you say, oh, I guess I'm not tired. And everyone around you sort of nodding their heads, yes, 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 it is all these other things. So just by sort of social conformity and alliance with your social environment, you say, oh, okay, well, I guess I was sort of reading that wrong. And it begins to sort of take you out of yourself and being able to read yourself. What I think is also so handicapping is that a cult is often, not always, but often run by a narcissist. So they need for you to feel dependent on them, and they need for you to believe that they are saving you from something. They're your savior now. And so they rewrite people's histories a lot of the time. Your life was awful. You were going in a bad direction. Proof is that you didn't achieve your spiritual attainment, or you didn't achieve your $1 million, or whatever it is we can offer you. That just proves that the people in your life were getting in your way, and you were getting in your own way. So you need to not be in contact with those people who are bringing you down. You can't trust your family anymore. They clearly didn't love you. And sort of all these things are rewritten and given as proof. And so then you stop being in touch with all the wonderful memories you have of your family. Or it could be that there are some bad memories too. That happens with families. But still, they're not people who are trying to sabotage you. You just learn to see them that way because the leader needs for you to see them that way. But I think also you get pushed into this sort of learned helplessness within a group, so that you learn to trust only the leadership and the people there. So even to make the smallest decisions. And if you're feeling like you really want to go this direction and not that direction, and they want you only to go in that direction, they will tell you why that direction is wrong. And you'll learn to wait like kind of a puppy waiting for instructions. Like, should I sit? Should I go? Should I eat? And because you feel like left to your own devices, you'd make the wrong decision. The other thing that happens is it's a closed system. So you can't call friends to find out if you're kind of reading something the right way, like maybe this group is a little bit messed up. You can't call your family. You can't do your research.
Or
So
if you
you're in
do,
this loop.
it's monitored.
It's monitored, right. And you'll also be told that something bad will happen to you. Either you'll be punished by the leader, you'll be put on the hot seat for hours on end, or something spiritually bad will happen to you. Like Scientology had this kind of fear put into its members that if they access certain spiritual ecumenical kind of information online, which was about Xenu, basically, that if you access it before you were ready, kind of before you were conditioned and programmed, which is how they define ready. Not that they would say that, but that's how they define ready. They would tell you that you would get cancer. So people were actually afraid to find out about this story of Xenu and body thetans and all these other things that would probably make people in that moment wake up and say, okay, yeah, bye-bye. So you can't find out the information. You need to check in and see if you can actually be trusting your own instincts on this or not. It is something that is so debilitating. And even after people leave, it takes them a long time to really start to rely again and trust the evidence of their senses.
Right. Okay. That leads on to my next question about the after effects of a person who has left a cult. So is it a different experience for, say, someone who was born into a cult than it is for someone who had willingly joined one?
There is, of course, some overlap. You have the same kind of feelings of shame and isolation. The world doesn't quite understand what I was just involved in, and they might look down on me. In fact, parents also go through a lot of that. They get blamed often. They're like, what's wrong with you and what was wrong with your parenting that your child got involved in this? So there's a whole shame and isolation for the loved ones as well, which I think is important to mention. So it's good if you have any friends who are the loved ones of people involved in cults, make sure that you don't convey that message that, you know, you're questioning what they did to that person to make them vulnerable. There is a huge amount of loss for people born in and also people who got involved later on. The loss of the promises that will never be fulfilled, even though they weren't going to be fulfilled anyway. The loss of this magical sense of protection. A lot of people in groups really feel like they can do anything and nothing bad will happen to them if they stay within the protection of the group. Loss of community, loss of family, loss of people who speak the same language, because, you know, cults usually have their own lingo. And so you get the sense these are the only people who really understand me. And I think there's also a lot of resentment for both people who have left and who were, you know, who got involved later, and people who were born in. Resentment of the leader, resentment if they got in later of the person who recruited them in, and anger about what happened. The difference that I've really noticed for people born in, though, is they don't have a frame of reference. They don't have a place to go back to. They usually don't have a family system that they left. So oftentimes when people leave, they've left everyone they ever knew in that group.
The cult was their family.
Right, exactly. It was their family, it was their community, it was their world. And so they're quite alone. And that's why part of the reason that I started this support group.
There's groups which are quite prevalent over here, like the Exclusive Brethren. If some of them leave, and if they've been born in, they won't even understand simple things like shaking hands.
Yes. So I've had lots of clients who were born in cults who will say, I don't know who to ask these questions of because I'm an adult now, and it should be that I know how much something costs in a store. It should be that I know that I have the right to my own body. It should be that I know what's appropriate in terms of how much to share verbally with somebody else. Because within a cult, you had to just share everything, your deepest, darkest secrets all the time, but only with people in the group, and anyone outside, you didn't say a word. So they don't know how to have just the basic conversation. And if something happens where they have to take on a task in their home, they have learned to not trust themselves. And who do they have to ask about what they should be eating that day? Down to very, very small decisions. It's overwhelming. It's really overwhelming. And there's also this other piece that I find so fascinating, that a lot of people raised in cults, they learn to have these two selves. They have a outward self, which seems very composed, put together. And it betrays and hides that part of them inside that is fraught with terror and this racing feeling, needing to please. There's a sense of a mission, and they can't sit for a moment. But outside, they're even. So people have no idea how much people who have left these cultic situations or lifelong cultic situations are really suffering inside.
You know, you mentioned cult leaders. You've actually met and interacted with a couple of them. So what can you tell us about those experiences? Because that must have been pretty eye-opening.
There are times when I've met certain cult leaders and I thought to myself, my life is weird. Why am I meeting? What am I doing? Why am I talking to this guru? That's so interesting. I mean, there are cult leaders who most of them are these kind of malignant narcissists. They have zero empathy. They seem like they do. They know how to pretend that they care, but they're amazing at and they have this sort of charisma. And then there are these other cult leaders who are just crazy people who are also charismatic and draw people into their psychosis, their kind of strange beliefs. I called it's sort of akin to this folie à deux, this shared psychosis that is an actual diagnosis. And then other ones who started out as just regular leaders or community leaders or spiritual leaders, and then morph into someone who is very dangerous, sort of a la the Jim Jones of the world. And so, yes, I met a man who believed in that we were all aliens. His name is Rael. He still runs the group, the Raelians.
Raelians, yes.
Right?
Cult, yeah.
He's an odd bird. But what was fascinating about him was, I mean, my very little interaction with him was that he put his hand on my head. I went to go check him out because I had some clients who had lost their kids to this group, and he was having a meeting at a local hotel. So I went to go meet him if I could. And did. I said I wanted to talk to him, and that there were families who were suffering because their children had gotten caught up in this, and could he help? He put his hand on my head, and then he compared me to the height of Jesus, which was, unexpected. And so I knew why he was doing that, and why he was doing that in front of people. It was to make people believe that he had met him. So I said, "Oh, are you letting me know you've met him?" And he said, "Well, of course." So that was interesting.
And to disarm you, hopefully, a bit as well, I'm assuming.
Right. And I said, "Well, I'm sure you've met, many people." And he said, "Yes, Buddha and Moses and a lot of other heavy hitters." But even though he was, he had his arms out, he had these flowing robes, and he seemed so kind of gentle and serene. When I asked if he could help these families, and if he could reach out to these people who had been pulled away into this group, he then kind of floated away. He suddenly turned with his robes following him, and he just, walked away, like he just didn't care. And so I think that was really kind of fascinating, that here he was so interested in kind of making an impression on me. And when he thought he could, he really liked me. And as soon as I was asking him to do something, really take responsibility, he was gone. I met, well, I was in the room with a man who used to run a group based on Jewish mysticism. And he has since passed. But he also had this sort of fatherly or grandfatherly presence. And he was coming down the stairs of this house where he was running some of the meetings. And he missed a step and stumbled a bit. Everyone went running to catch him. And I thought that he, according to sort of how spiritual and mystical he is, he would be grateful. But instead, he kind of looked at everybody, scowled, and then everyone kind of looked down. And I said to the person who had invited me, "What's happening?" And they said, "Well, we believe in energy. And because he's perfect, because he missed a step, there's somebody in this room that caused that with their negative energy. And negative energy could be that they just doubted him for a moment. So everyone kind of looked inward to see if they had caused it." That was fascinating. That was fascinating also to see the group dynamic, the social pressure to take responsibility for things kind of endlessly that were just not your doing, that were not your fault, but also that the rules only apply to the followers, not to the leader, right? He doesn't have to take responsibility for what he's doing to anyone else, and how many lives I think that he was destroying. But everyone else, the people lower down, have to take responsibility for everything, including him. And then I also met someone who called herself a gypsy mom. And this was quite disturbing, actually. There are some people who are in families that are considered to be gypsies, and I know that that's not, the most politically correct word to use it, but I'm just using it because that's what they called themselves. And I think originally Romani and part of the sort of Gypsy Circuit of people.
You do get a lot of that over here. Yeah, that word is used quite a bit over here and in Ireland as well.
Okay. So this particular family was running a couple of different shops, palm readings, tarot cards, all of it. And the woman who became my client went into one of the stores, got her palm read, and they asked her name. Her last name was the same as somebody famous, so they assumed that she was part of this famous family, which she was not. But they assumed then if they kind of used her, they could extort money from her family, which the family did not have. So they just hung on to her as an indentured servant and convinced her that she had to kind of work for them in order to be safe. She had to give up her life. She was sleeping on the floor. They sometimes drugged her. It was a really bad situation for a long time, made her very messed up. It was in an attempt, as they had convinced her, to keep her parents alive, who she was very close to. And this gypsy mom said she could see that something was terribly wrong with the parents. The parents had called the police. They said that their daughter now was a missing person because they couldn't find her for a period of time. And then they wound up, this gypsy mom and this daughter wound up in a mall, actually, in Los Angeles. And I was called by security to come because I was a name listed if this person showed up. And the police were called, and the police protected the gypsy mom, actually, from us. It was so disturbing. They made a line between us and them, and the parents showed up as well. They hadn't seen their daughter in years. And the police, who really don't know how to handle these situations, said,
I bet you've seen this sort of thing before with police, haven't you?
Yes. It's more than frustrating. It's devastating. It was devastating for the family. It was enough where the clerks in the store were disturbed to see this very tough woman really dragging this other girl around and having the girl be the one to open up new lines of credit to buy things for this woman, that she just wanted to get new clothes and she wanted to get new things for her house, and she was using this girl to do it. And the police showed up and they said, "Is this girl over 18?" And the girl said that she was. She looked very dazed. She didn't know what was going on. And the police said, "That's all we need to know." And they formed a line. The gypsy mom carried her away. It was years before the parents found her again. Parents just fell to the ground in the middle of this. It was in the parking garage by the security office, crying. It was really horrible. And in fact, now I have this girl as a client. And she said in that moment, she felt hopeless. Because even though she still believed something bad would happen to her parents, that had gotten under her skin, she thought, "Oh my goodness, if the police are here, that confirms for me," right? Taking in the evidence of your senses, that confirms for me that something that is happening to me is actually wrong. And maybe I'm right about that. And then suddenly when the police protected her and the gypsy mom, she said, "That's it. My life is over. I'm stuck here forever." So I think police don't realize how much they are devastating the people in those situations and making them feel hopeless.
Gosh, wow, what a story. Okay, well, let's talk a little bit about the podcast. You produce the IndoctriNation podcast along with Jonathan Daniel Brown and have interviewed ex-members of, like we said, the Church of Scientology, Jehovah's Witnesses as well, many, many more. Can you talk about the podcast and some of your favorite experiences recording the show?
I love doing it. I love being able to talk to people. And now I'm getting probably what you're getting, which is that people are contacting me. This is, they probably contact you and say,
"Yep,
I'd love to be on your show," right? Which is just fantastic that people see it as an avenue to get their information out. So because I think it's important for people to not only hear about people's stories, but also to hear about how it happens and why it happens, and what people need after they get out. I do this little piece at the end, this one more thing before you go, which is this educational piece. Okay, now we heard from so-and-so and this is their issue. What can be done if this has happened to you? You know, I think I don't want to leave people with, "Oh yeah, that was a devastating story. Bye-bye." I want there to be something practical. But also there are people in the field who I want to learn from, who I think the audience wants to learn from: sociologists, historians, people who have studied the mind, who can talk about undue influence, lawyers who have dealt with cult cases and the limitations of the law. Those were very interesting conversations. But
there's so many permutations. We could, you could even, like we were talking about the police, perhaps get somebody on who understands that aspect of this.
Yeah, it's very true. And what's also been interesting is to talk to people who deal with parental alienation now and narcissism and dealing with divorce when there is one part of the couple that is really brainwashing the kids to make them think that other parent is dangerous to them so they can get full custody. I mean, these kids are kind of caught in the vortex of this kind of undue influence at times. So it's been interesting to hear from these different people. There have been two kind of situations that have been the most moving, I think, for me so far. One is when if people are local, they're not calling in from a far distance and they're able to come to the office for the recording. And if they are former clients, they'll come into the office and always say something like, wow, the first time I walked in here, I didn't know where I was. I didn't know what was happening to me. I had no sense of who I was. I was a shell. And since that time, I've gotten this, I've gotten that. I have a job, I have a spouse, I have, a child. Just for them to have that moment where they can reflect back about where they were the last time they stepped through that door is very powerful. And also when I have parents and children on together, where they can talk about what happened. In most cases, it's the parent getting the child out. I've had some situations where children have come to me trying to get their parents out of something. But so far on the podcast, it's been parents and children, and they each tell the same story about what happened, but from their own perspectives, and gain a lot of insight. And the parents say to the kids, "Oh, I had no idea you were suffering so much." And the kid said, "Yeah, I know. I wasn't allowed to tell you." And I also put it on myself, thinking there was something wrong with me if I was feeling that way. And the parent talks about having gone to the police, having gone to local politicians, having gone to conferences, and the kids had no idea they were working so hard. So there's a lot of, there are a lot of tears in that moment of really kind of understanding somebody's story and somebody's experience. They lived it through the story together in a kind of parallel way, doing different things to get to a good outcome.
Wow. Okay, Rachel, that was absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. I think that's going to wrap it up. Thank you for coming on to Talk Beliefs, and thank you especially for all the good work that you do. But before we sign off, if there is anyone watching who is in a cult or knows someone who is in a cult and is perhaps unsure of which way to turn, what advice would you give to them right now?
For us all to be aware that, because I've worked with over 1,000 former cult members by now, most people in cults are unhappy for a long time before they leave. So even though, we assume they're fine because they seem fine, it's because they're supposed to. They usually have to report back to the people in the group to say, "Oh, I was able to meet with my family and I didn't break," But very often they're just made too afraid to leave. But they really wish they could. And sometimes they're wishing to be rescued, which is an important thing to remember. And so I think it's important, if anyone is in a cultic group or in a controlling relationship now that they feel that they can't get out of, or that this is the best decision for them, even though it's making them suffer, because they've been made to feel that the world outside is a terrible place, or this is the best relationship they can get, no one will love them the same way. I want to tell everyone that it gets better once you leave, and not believe the message that this is the best you can do, and that once you leave, you'll see that actually you're not in as much physical or spiritual or emotional danger as you were before, and there's hope. I think what's also important is for people to know too that they can contact the Open Minds Foundation, they can contact the International Cultic Studies Association, they can contact me, they can contact Freedom of Mind with Steve Hassan, who I used to work with. And we will not report back to your cult that you called. It will be a completely safe call and completely anonymous. You don't even have to give your name, but just let us guide you.
And we're going to put all those links in the description below for what you've mentioned and more.
Wonderful. That's wonderful. And I think also for the people who love someone or know someone who's involved in a cult, you want to be a safe lifeline to them. You want to not be judgmental of them having been involved in this or being involved in it, because no one goes out to join a cult. They didn't know that that's what they were getting involved in. They got involved in kind of a well-oiled machine of manipulation. Yeah. And so even if you as a loved one or a friend have been pushed away, even if you receive that mean letter like, "Bye-bye, I don't want anything to do with you anymore," ignore it. Don't let the people in a cult feel like the bridge has been burned and there's no way back. So even if they pushed you away, even if they've been mean to you, don't burden them with how much they hurt you. Just let them know that the bridge is still there, and that you still care about them, and that you'll link arms with them on their journey to freedom.
Rachel, thank you so much indeed. And we all look forward to the next IndoctriNation podcast. It's a weekly podcast, isn't it?
Yeah, weekly conversation podcast every Wednesday morning. It comes out here on the West Coast. And so, yeah, new episodes every week.
Fantastic. And hopefully we'll get to catch up with you in the not too distant future and talk about some other things.
And I love your show. I love what you're doing. So it's really wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much.